Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of his property in Carmel by the sea, the salty ocean breeze tugging at his jacket. His weathered hands rested on the wooden fence as he scanned the horizon. But something was wrong. The land didn't look right. There were stakes driven into the ground, marking off territory that wasn't supposed to be touched. Heavy machinery hummed in the distance. Dust and debris floated in the air. Clint's sharp blue eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his cowboy hat. He stepped toward the commotion, his boots crunching over gravel. A group of construction workers stood near the machinery, clad in reflective vests and hard hats. One of them, a burly man with tattooed arms, noticed him approaching. "Hey!" Clint called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "Who authorized this?" The man turned and smirked. "You're Eastwood, right? Thought you'd show up eventually." "I didn't authorize this." Clint's voice was low and steady. "This is my land." The worker shrugged. "Take it up with the boss." Clint's eyes hardened. He pushed past the worker, heading toward a sleek black SUV parked at the edge of the site. Standing beside it was Gerald Madsen, a tall man in his mid-50s, with slicked back hair and an expensive suit that practically screamed arrogance. He sipped from a coffee cup as Clint approached. "Gerald," Clint said coldly. "Mr. Eastwood," Madsen replied, smiling faintly. "What brings you out here?" Clint's jaw tightened. "You know exactly why I'm here." He pointed toward the construction site. "That's my land you're building on." Madsen's smile widened. "Well, there's some disagreement about that." "There's no disagreement," Clint said. "I have the deed. The property lines are clear." Madsen stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, Clint. You've had this land for a long time. Maybe it's time to think about letting it go. We could make you a very generous offer." Clint's eyes darkened. "I'm not selling." Madsen's smile thinned. "Then you'll have to go through the courts." "I intend to." Clint stepped closer, his face inches from Madsen's. "But when I win, you'd better hope you've got another place to build." Madsen's smile vanished. He leaned in and whispered, "You're making a mistake, Eastwood." Clint's expression didn't change. "No. You did." Clint turned and walked away, his boots echoing over the gravel. The construction workers watched him go, some snickering under their breath. Clint didn't care. He had fought bigger battles than this and won. But as he walked away, he felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Madsen wasn't going to play fair. And this fight was far from over. Clint sat on the edge of his old leather couch, staring at a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of him and his late wife, standing on that very same land. Her arm was wrapped around his waist, her smile bright and carefree. That land wasn't just property. It was history. It was family. The phone rang. Clint picked it up without looking. "Clint Eastwood," he said. "Mr. Eastwood." The voice on the other end was calm, controlled and cold. "Gerald Madsen." "You've got some nerve calling me," Clint said. Madsen's voice softened. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away, Clint. No harm, no foul. You drop the case, and we'll make this whole thing disappear." "And if I don't?" A long pause. Then Madsen's voice sharpened. "Then you're going to regret it?" Clint's grip tightened around the phone. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm giving you a way out," Madsen replied smoothly. "Smart men know when to take it." Clint's hand shook slightly as he hung up the phone. He walked to the window, looking out over the land. His land. His wife's memory lived there. Her laughter in the wind. Her footsteps on the soil. He couldn't walk away from that. The next morning, Clint walked into the office of Jacob Reynolds, an old friend and retired surveyor. Jacob looked up from behind his desk, surprised. "Clint. I need your help," Clint said. Jacob leaned back. "What's this about?" "Gerald Madsen," Clint replied. Jacob sighed. "Madsen? That's a big fight." "I don't care how big it is," Clint said. "He's trying to steal my land. I need to prove he's crossed the line." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a movie, Clint." Clint smiled faintly. "Good. I'm better at real life." Jacob sighed. "All right. Let's see what we've got." Jacob pulled out an old file containing the original property surveys. He spread the documents across the desk. Clint studied them carefully, his finger tracing the boundary lines. "This is the line," Clint said. "And this?" He tapped a separate map showing the construction site. "Is where Madsen's building is." Jacob nodded grimly. "That's encroachment." Clint folded the papers carefully. "Then we've got him." Jacob hesitated. "Clint. Madsen's got deep pockets. He's got the best lawyers money can buy." Clint's eyes sharpened. "Then I guess I'll have to do this myself." Jacob frowned. "You're not seriously thinking of representing yourself?" Clint smiled faintly. "I've stood my ground before." Jacob shook his head. "This isn't a Western, Clint." "No," Clint said. "But the rules are the same." The Monterey County Courthouse was packed. Reporters crowded into the gallery, cameras flashing as Clint walked into the courtroom alone. He wore a dark suit, crisp and clean, despite its age. His face was impassive, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. On the other side of the aisle, Gerald Madsen sat confidently beside his lawyer, Gerald Parker, a tall, polished man in an expensive gray suit. Parker watched Clint with a slight smirk. Thump. 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 Judge Wallace Bridger entered the room, his eyes narrowing at Clint. He adjusted his glasses, clearly unimpressed. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Bridger said, "I understand you're representing yourself." "That's right, Your Honor." "Are you sure about that?" Clint stood. "I'm sure." The judge sighed. "Very well. Mr. Parker, opening statement." Parker rose with practiced ease. "Your Honor, this is a simple misunderstanding about property boundaries. Mr. Eastwood is confused. My client, Mr. Madsen, acted within the full limits of the law." Clint's eyes didn't waver. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Bridger said. Clint rose slowly. He walked toward the jury, his hands resting on the table before him. His gaze was steady. "In 1992, I bought that land," Clint said. "And it's still mine." "That's not confusion. That's a fact." The room fell silent. Clint sat down. Across the courtroom, Parker's smirk faded. He realized Clint wasn't going to be as easy to beat as he thought. And the game had just begun. Clint Eastwood sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as the tension in the courtroom thickened. Across the aisle, Gerald Madsen sat with his arms crossed, a faint smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. He looked like a man who had already won. But Clint knew better. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Bridger said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. You may call your first witness. Clint stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. Your Honor, I call Jacob Reynolds to the stand. Jacob Reynolds, a weathered man in his late 60s with a mop of gray hair, walked toward the witness stand. He had the sturdy build of a man who had spent most of his life working outdoors. He adjusted his glasses as he was sworn in. Mr. Reynolds, Clint began, his voice steady, how long have you worked as a land surveyor? 42 years, Jacob replied. And have you had experience working with property lines in Carmel by the Sea? Jacob nodded. I've handled more cases here than I can count. I know the land better than I know my own house. Clint walked over to the evidence table and pulled out a large map. He unrolled it carefully, the paper crackling as he laid it across the table. He pointed to a line marked clearly in red. Mr. Reynolds, is this the official boundary line for my property? Jacob leaned forward, studying the map carefully before looking up. Yes. That's the line recorded with the county in 1992. It's legally binding. Clint nodded. And this? He pointed to a shaded section overlapping the boundary line. This is where Madson's construction is taking place, correct? Jacob nodded again. That's right. It's a clear violation of property boundaries. Parker stood, buttoning his jacket as he approached the witness stand with a measured smile. Mr. Reynolds, Parker began, his voice smooth, you've been working as a surveyor for over 40 years. Surely you know that property boundaries can shift over time, right? Jacob's brow furrowed. Legally? No. Parker chuckled lightly. But mistakes can happen. Permits get misfiled, records are lost. It's entirely possible that Mr. Madson's team was working off inaccurate information, isn't it? Jacob shook his head. The records are clear. The land is Clint's. Parker's smile tightened. But you're close friends with Mr. Eastwood, aren't you? Jacob's expression hardened. I've known Clint for years, yes. So it's possible that your loyalty to him might be clouding your professional judgment. Jacob's jaw tensed. I'm not on that stand as Clint's friend. I'm here as a professional surveyor, and I'm telling you that Madson's construction is illegal. Parker's eyes darkened. He turned toward the judge. No further questions. Clint watched Parker return to his seat. His composure was still intact, but Clint could see the subtle signs of tension, the way Parker's hand curled slightly into a fist, the way Madson leaned toward him and whispered something through clenched teeth. They knew the ground beneath them was starting to crack. Clint stood and turned toward the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Bridger adjusted his glasses. We'll continue tomorrow at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck the wood with a sharp crack. Clint watched as Madson and Parker left the courtroom, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Parker leaned toward Madson as they exited. I've got this under control, Parker whispered. Madson's eyes flashed with anger. You'd better. Clint smiled faintly to himself as he stood. No, you don't, he muttered under his breath. The next morning, Clint arrived early at the courthouse. The sunlight was thin and pale, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing as Clint walked through the entrance. Mr. Eastwood, one reporter shouted. Do you really think you can win this case without a lawyer? Clint stopped and adjusted the brim of his hat. Justice isn't about who's got the best lawyer. It's about who's telling the truth. Inside the courtroom, Parker was already seated, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. Your Honor, Parker said as Judge Bridger settled in, before we proceed, the defense would like to introduce evidence that may clarify the property boundaries in question. Clint's eyes narrowed as Parker handed a leather-bound folder to the judge. Judge Bridger opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. "These are revised zoning permits." Parker nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. These documents show that the property boundaries may have been altered after Mr. Eastwood's original purchase." Clint stood. "Your Honor, those permits were never filed with the county. They're invalid." Parker smiled faintly. "We'll let the court decide that." Judge Bridger sighed. "I'll allow it, for now." Clint's jaw tightened as Parker sat down, that smug look still on his face. He was playing dirty. But Clint wasn't surprised. That was Madsen's style: manipulate the system until the truth was so buried under paperwork that no one could dig it out. Clint leaned toward Jacob, who was seated behind him. "We need something stronger." Jacob nodded. "I might have an idea. Let me make a few calls." Clint watched Parker stand and call his next witness, a slick real estate agent named James Whitaker. Whitaker took the stand, adjusting his gold watch as he settled in. Parker walked toward him confidently. "Mr. Whitaker, you've reviewed the zoning permits, correct?" Whitaker smiled. "Yes. And in your professional opinion, is there any evidence that Mr. Madsen's construction was knowingly illegal?" Whitaker shook his head. "Not from what I've seen. It seems like a simple misunderstanding." Parker smiled triumphantly. "No further questions." Clint stood slowly, walking toward the stand. He placed both hands on the rail in front of Whitaker, leaning in slightly. "Mr. Whitaker," Clint said, his voice low and steady, "how much does Madsen pay you for consulting?" Whitaker's smile faltered. "I don't see how that's relevant." Clint's gaze sharpened. "Answer the question." Whitaker's eyes flicked toward Parker nervously. $50,000. Clint smiled faintly. $50,000 to say this was a misunderstanding. Whitaker opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Clint straightened. "No further questions." Whitaker climbed out of the stand, his face pale. Parker's confidence wavered as Clint returned to his seat. Jacob leaned toward Clint. "I got something," he whispered. Clint's eyes glinted. "What is it?" Jacob smiled. "A name." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Whose?" Jacob's smile widened. "Daniel O'Malley." Clint sat back, his hands clasped. He had the faintest hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. Parker saw the look, and for the first time since the trial began, Clint saw fear in Parker's eyes. "Tomorrow," Clint said softly, "it's over." The courtroom was buzzing with low murmurs the next morning as Clint Eastwood entered. His stride was steady, measured, the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The trial had already shifted in tone. The audience, which had initially shown up for the spectacle of Clint representing himself, was now starting to believe that he could actually win. Across the room, Gerald Madsen sat at the defense table, his polished exterior starting to crack. His lawyer, Gerald Parker, was hunched over a stack of documents, whispering furiously to Madsen. "Calm down," Parker hissed. "We still control the narrative." Madsen's eyes darkened. "Then why are we losing?" Parker didn't answer. His gaze flicked toward Clint, who stood at the plaintiff's table, calm and composed as ever. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice clear, "I would like to call Daniel O'Malley to the stand." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Parker's head shot up, his mouth tightening. Madsen's eyes narrowed dangerously. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Daniel O'Malley entered. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a work jacket and worn jeans. His boots scuffed against the floor as he walked toward the witness stand. His face was lined, his expression tense. Judge Bridger's eyes narrowed. "Mr. O'Malley, please state your occupation for the record." "I'm a construction foreman," O'Malley said, his voice rough from years of shouting over heavy machinery. "And who have you worked for recently?" Clint asked. O'Malley's gaze flicked toward Madsen, who was watching him like a predator. O'Malley's jaw tightened. "Madsen Development Corporation." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the gallery. Parker sat up straighter, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. Clint's eyes sharpened. "Mr. O'Malley, were you aware that Madsen Development was building on my land?" O'Malley hesitated. Sweat gathered at his temples. "Yes." Parker shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor." "Speculation." "Overruled," Judge Bridger said sharply. "Continue, Mr. Eastwood." Clint stepped closer to the stand, his gaze locked on O'Malley's face. His voice lowered, steady as stone. "Did you report this to anyone?" O'Malley swallowed hard. "No." "And why not?" O'Malley's gaze dropped to the floor. "Because I was told not to." Clint's eyes narrowed. "By whom?" O'Malley's mouth twisted. His eyes shifted toward Madsen. "By Gerald Madsen." The room erupted into shocked whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Judge Bridger banged his gavel for order. "Quiet." Clint's expression didn't change. "Mr. O'Malley, are you saying that Madsen knew his construction was illegal?" O'Malley exhaled slowly. "Yes." "And what did he tell you to do?" O'Malley's voice dropped, but the microphone caught every word. "He told me to keep quiet. To cover up the boundaries." Parker shot to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Judge Bridger's gaze sharpened. "Sit down, Mr. Parker." Clint leaned toward O'Malley. His voice was quiet but razor-sharp. "Why are you telling the truth now?" O'Malley's hands tightened into fists on his knees. "Because I watched you fight, Mr. Eastwood. You stood up there alone. No lawyer. No corporate team. Just the truth. And I realized I didn't want to be part of the lie anymore." Clint's gaze held steady. He gave O'Malley the smallest nod of respect. "No further questions." As O'Malley stepped down from the stand, Parker leaned toward Madsen. His voice was sharp and low. "We're losing control of this." Madsen's face was pale with anger. "Then get it back." Later that evening, Clint stepped out of the courthouse into the cool night air. The reporters had long since packed up and left. The street lights buzzed faintly in the distance. Clint adjusted his hat and started walking toward his car. But as he crossed the empty parking lot, a dark figure stepped from the shadows. "Mr. Eastwood." Clint stopped. Slowly, he turned. Gerald Madsen stood beneath the glow of a streetlight, his hands tucked into the pockets of his expensive coat. "Madsen," Clint said flatly. Madsen stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. "You've made a big mistake." Clint's eyes narrowed. "By proving you're a thief." Madsen's mouth curled into a dark smile. "By thinking this ends in a courtroom." Clint's jaw tensed. "Are you threatening me?" Madsen's smile widened. "I'm making you a promise." He stepped closer until his face was inches from Clint's. Walk away now, and I'll let you keep what's left of your life. Clint's gaze sharpened. His hands remained at his sides, but his entire frame stiffened. You think you scare me? Madsen's eyes gleamed coldly. You're an old man playing cowboy. I don't need to scare you. I just need to outlast you. Clint's gaze didn't waver. Then you'd better prepare to lose. Madsen's smile thinned. You're going to regret this. Clint stepped even closer, his voice low and lethal. You've made the same mistake every coward makes, Clint said. You think money buys justice. But it doesn't. Madsen's smile faded. Clint turned and walked toward his car. He didn't look back as Madsen's figure faded into the shadows. But Clint knew this fight was about to get ugly. The courtroom was packed to capacity the next morning. The atmosphere was charged with tension and almost electric hum beneath the surface. Clint stood at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting lightly on the table's edge. Across from him, Parker and Madsen sat rigid, their expressions stony. Mr. Eastwood, Judge Bridger said, you may present your final evidence. Clint opened his file and pulled out a small flash drive. He walked toward the bailiff and handed it to him. Play it, Clint said. A video appeared on the large courtroom monitor. It was grainy at first, a recording of a boardroom meeting. Madsen's voice came through the speakers. Push the boundaries. Eastwood won't fight it, and if he does, we'll bury him in legal fees. The courtroom exploded in gasps. Parker's face drained of color. Madsen shot to his feet. That's fabricated, he shouted. Judge Bridger's voice cut through the chaos. Sit down, Mr. Madsen. Clint's gaze locked on Madsen. His voice was calm and deadly. You thought you could buy your way out of this. But the truth always comes out. Madsen's fists clenched at his sides. Clint walked back to his table and sat down. His gaze never left Madsen. Justice isn't about money, Clint said softly. It's about what's right. Madsen's face twisted with rage. But Clint knew the game was over. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury had been deliberating for hours. Clint Eastwood sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped in front of him. His eyes were steady, his expression calm, but beneath that calm exterior was the simmering weight of everything that had led him here. Across the aisle, Gerald Madsen sat rigid in his chair. His face was pale, his jaw locked tight. Gerald Parker sat beside him, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. The polished confidence Parker had displayed throughout the trial was gone. Now he looked like a man who was waiting for the axe to fall. The door to the jury room opened with a quiet creak. A middle-aged woman with short brown hair, the jury forewoman, walked toward the bench, holding a sealed envelope in her hands. Judge Bridger's gaze followed her as she handed him the envelope. Bridger cleared his throat, his expression more serious than it had been throughout the entire trial. He opened the envelope and pulled out the folded sheet of paper. The sound of paper rustling filled the dead silence in the room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Bridger said, his eyes scanning the verdict, have you reached a unanimous decision? Yes, Your Honor, the forewoman replied. Bridger nodded. He looked toward Clint first, then toward Madsen. His face remained neutral as he read aloud. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Clint Eastwood. A stunned silence settled over the courtroom for a brief, electric moment. Then the murmur of voices rose, a cascade of whispers and gasps. Bridger's voice carried over the noise. We find that the defendant, Gerald Madsen, and Madsen Development Corporation knowingly and willfully encroached upon Mr. Eastwood's property and acted in bad faith. The court awards the plaintiff full compensation for the damages incurred, as well as additional punitive damages. Clint's hands remained still on the table. He didn't smile. He didn't even move. His gaze remained locked on Madsen. Gerald Parker shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is..." Bridger's hand shot up. "Sit down, Mr. Parker." Parker's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Slowly, he sat back down. Madsen's face twisted with anger. He leaned toward Parker and hissed, "You told me we'd win." Parker's face had gone pale. "We should have settled," he whispered. Madsen's knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. "No. This isn't over." Clint stood slowly. His eyes met Madsen's, calm and razor-sharp. He adjusted the brim of his hat as he stepped away from the table. Madsen shot up from his seat, rage flashing in his eyes. "You think this means anything?" he growled. Clint stopped. He turned back toward Madsen. His gaze was steady, cold. "This means you lost," Clint said. Madsen's lips curled. "You think you've beaten me? This is just a game to you." Clint's expression darkened. "You think this is a game?" He stepped closer until he was face to face with Madsen. "You stole from me. You lied about it. And when that didn't work, you tried to bury me in the system. But the system caught up with you. And now..." Clint's eyes narrowed. "You pay." Madsen's face twisted with fury. Clint adjusted his hat. "Court's over, Gerald." Madsen's hands curled into fists. But Clint didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away. Judge Bridger's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Court is adjourned." As Clint walked toward the exit, the gallery erupted. Reporters scrambled toward him, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward his face. "Mr. Eastwood." "Clint. How does it feel to win?" "Mr. Eastwood, do you have a statement?" Clint stopped at the doors of the courtroom. He turned toward the sea of reporters and let the silence hang for a beat. "Justice isn't about money," Clint said, his voice steady and calm. "It's about what's right." He turned and walked through the doors. Behind him, Gerald Madsen sat frozen in his chair, his eyes dark with hatred. Parker sat beside him, his head down, his hands shaking. Madsen's empire had begun to crack and Clint Eastwood had been the one to break it. Clint stood at the edge of his property in Carmel by the sea. The sky was a soft gray, the ocean breeze cool against his face. The construction site was gone now, the heavy machinery, the noise, the chaos, all of it erased by the court order. Jacob Reynolds stood beside him, hands in his jacket pockets. "Looks good," Jacob said. "Back the way it should be." Clint nodded. "It's not about the land." Jacob smiled faintly. "I know." Clint's gaze drifted toward the horizon. His eyes softened as he remembered the quiet evenings standing here with his wife, the sound of her laughter mixed with the crash of the waves. He felt a presence nearby. Clint turned and saw Daniel O'Malley standing a few feet away, looking uncertain. "Mr. Eastwood," O'Malley said quietly. Clint studied him for a long moment. "What is it?" O'Malley shifted awkwardly. "I just wanted to say thank you." Clint raised an eyebrow. O'Malley's gaze dropped. "I've worked for men like Madsen my whole life. I should have spoken up sooner. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was scared." Clint's eyes sharpened. "And what changed?" O'Malley met his gaze. "You did." Clint's expression softened. He nodded toward the fence line. I'm going to need someone to help rebuild the damage. O'Malley's eyes widened. You mean? If you want to work for someone who doesn't cut corners, Clint said, the job's yours. A small smile touched O'Malley's mouth. I'd be honored. O'Malley shook Clint's hand firmly. Jacob leaned toward Clint. You sure about this? Clint smiled faintly. A man deserves a second chance. Just then, a black SUV rolled up on the road. The window slid down and Gerald Madsen's face appeared, his eyes burning with quiet fury. This isn't over, Madsen said. Clint's gaze sharpened. Yes, it is. Madsen's mouth curled into a bitter smile. You think you've won? Clint stepped toward the car, his expression cold and unwavering. You think this was about winning? He leaned in toward the window. This was about reminding men like you that justice still matters. Madsen's smile faded. He rolled the window up and the SUV pulled away. Jacob chuckled. You just made a powerful enemy. Clint watched the car disappear over the hill. No, he said quietly. I just reminded him that some things can't be bought. Clint stood at the fence, his hands resting on the wood. The land stretched before him, quiet and untouched. A soft breeze carried the scent of salt and the distant sound of the waves. Clint's eyes softened as he gazed out over the land. He could almost hear his wife's voice on the wind. You kept your promise, she seemed to say. Clint adjusted his hat. Yeah, he whispered. I did. He turned and walked toward the house, his boots crunching over the gravel. Behind him, the ocean stretched toward the horizon, eternal and untouchable. And Clint Eastwood, as always, walked away with his head held high.